Hi, welcome to Port 16 on the Lackawanna Cut-Off. Rebuilding the Cut-Off. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh, and I'm president of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association. And we're going to take a trip over the Cut-Off between here at Lake Hopatcong and Andover. That's roughly about 7.5 miles. We're just a little bit east, maybe a quarter mile or so east of Port Morris Junction here. Now, hopefully we can make it across since we've had several storms over the last few weeks. Don't know what we'll encounter, so we'll do our best. Now, what we're going to do is, when we go across the cutoff, I'll try to point out different things, and then we will end up at Andover, which is our final destination, but there's also things to talk about over there, specifically the station site itself. There was an alternate station site which we will visit, and then the Hudson Farm culvert, which we will also visit to show you there and discuss the issues that have been surrounding that particular location. But first, what we will do is we will go to, for those of you who've been following the series, we'll go to part 3 of the interview with Larry Malski, who will be talking about the period of time. When we say rebuilding the cutoff, we're talking about the period from the acquisition of the cutoff by the state of New Jersey, the Department of Transportation, in 2001 by the use of eminent domain, through the present time. We're talking 2018. And we will cover the things that have happened in between. I will go over that at Andover. And that's all of that will take place after the interview with Larry Malski, which will be first, and then we'll take the trip across the cutoff. So here's Larry Malski, president of the Pennsylvania Northeast Regional Railroad Authority. Here we are back at the Bridge 60 Tower in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and we'll be talking to Larry Malski, who's president of the Pennsylvania Northeast Regional Railroad Authority. And in this segment, we're talking about the time frame during which the planning and the rebuilding of the cutoff will start. That's from 2001 until the present time, 2017, 2018. This is a key time because not only is there action taking place in New Jersey, but also in Pennsylvania. Now, once the line is acquired by the state of New Jersey, that opens the door to the seeking of funding for the replacement of track. Now, this brings us into the almost dreaded subject of studies. In other words, where there needs to be documentation, data, whatever, planning type of information that is provided to the government to justify funding for a particular project. In this case, the rebuilding of the cutoff, at least in the initial stage, phase 1, to Andover. So I'm going to turn it over to Larry, and my first question is, maybe you can talk to the whole discussion of studies, because I know that I'm sure that no one really likes to hear about that, and sometimes I know people have a very disparaging view of it, but there's they're not done just for the sake of doing them. Clearly, there's a real reason. Maybe you can speak to why studies are necessary and what is accomplished by conducting them.
Sure. We'll call this the dreaded studies segment, and again, we've been involved with them from day one, and everyone wishes the system, the entire system, the funding system could be much more efficient. But you have to play with the deck of cards that you're dealt, and we are dealing with the same issues that Los Angeles, Atlanta, Chicago, you name a city who's building light rail or extending rail or extending heavy rail or whatever form of transit that they're adding to, building, or dealing with, and everyone has had to deal on the same level. You could question the need for some of the studies that have been done, but the bottom line is, at the end of the day, the studies have led directly to $69 million in funding for the first segment, and that segment, of course, is Port Morris to Andover. The studies have dealt with a lot of issues that the feds and the states wanted answers to before they would commit to funding. It's as simple as that. And some of them are quite honestly valid questions, like how much does it cost? How many people are you going to transport? The myriad of what's the service going to look like? So again, I'll be the first to say that I wish it could be a more efficient process, but it is what it is. I mean, the good news is we're past the study phase. We're into construction. This project right now is viewed in Washington and in the state's capitals as a project that's underway. It's not a question, it's on the drawing board, it's not theoretical, it's funded, it's under construction, and like most of these projects around the country, it'll be done in phases. The feds or anyone doesn't just write you a check and say, here's the check, go build it and tell us when it's done. These projects are large, they require large sums of money, and they're done in phases. And that's not even just transit projects. Highway projects and other projects, major transportation infrastructure projects, are done on that basis in this country. And that's the way it is, basically. It'd be nice if it was faster and more efficient, but that's the way it is across the board. So we're not the only one that have been plagued with the years and years of studies. Like I said, the good news is we're past the study phase, and basically we are now seeking funding for construction, which is underway on the first 7 miles, and engineering, and you need both. You can't construct a project without having engineering in place, obviously to bid the project out, to have the proper specs, to meet federal and state requirements, to meet all the other permitting and other issues you need to do to build. And that's the rules of the game, and that's what's out there if you want to complete the project. So I guess in a nutshell, if you don't have the studies and if you don't have the engineering done, you're not going to build a project. And that's the nature of federal and state and local funding for transportation projects. Again, the good news is we're underway. It's an established project with the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, which is the entity in Washington where the majority of the funding is coming from. You have to live by their rules, their guidelines, their regulations if you want the money, and if you want the money to continue to flow. So that's basically where we're at. Very specifically, the next major goal is once the Andover section is completed, is to address the main link in the chain, and that's the 21 miles between Andover and the water gap, and I should say the Delaware River. That will be basically, the next major phase of funding. We are now seeking, just like we did for the first 7 miles, construction monies and engineering monies to complete that segment and get the 21 miles back, and thereby have the entire cutoff put back. We believe, and we're very optimistic, quite honestly, because there are some very important things happening, not only just from a public perspective, but from a political perspective, which is very important in projects of this nature. And that is that in Pennsylvania, We've got very, very good support from our Congressman Cartwright, who represents Northeast Pennsylvania, is a true advocate of the project. He has stated as such and has made it one of his priority top 3 projects that he's supporting and going after in his district. And he has been named to the House Appropriations Committee in Washington, which is a very important committee in terms of funding. As important, in New Jersey, the main proponent and advocate of the first 7 miles and the $69 million, which has already been acquired for the first 7 miles, is Congressman Frelinghuysen, who also is on the House Appropriations Committee, but a little more importantly, he is just been appointed the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. So you have the 2 congressmen in the House in Washington who have made this project one of their priorities. They're true advocates of the project. That speaks for itself. It's a very important aligning of the stars, if you will, or however you want to couch it, but a very important aspect of seeking funding and to advance the project. Obviously, there's other changes in New Jersey with the governorship of Governor Murphy, and other positions that hopefully will align with the concept of moving the funding for this next phase, the 21 miles forward. On the broader scope, from a political perspective, there is serious talk in Washington of a major infrastructure funding bill next year during 2018 that would address many of the infrastructure needs that are desperately needed across this country in all modes of transportation. Again, talking about the stars, hopefully the timing of that could not be much better, because we haven't had a major federal transportation infrastructure focus and or funding bill in many years. So that hopefully will tie in with the support we now have. In Pennsylvania, we also have support from Senator Casey, who's of course from the Scranton area, and has been an advocate of the project all along. And again, we can count on kind of a bi-state support for a bi-state project, because that's what this is. This is a bi-state project. And again, something we mentioned before, the bi-state nature of this. Again, it's a bi-state project. Usually that makes it a little bit more complex to do one of these projects, but we certainly have enough examples of bi-state heavy rail transportation operations in our area. We've previously talked about the Port Jervis trains, the Vulcan to Port Jervis trains, but out of New York City area, metropolitan area, you've got all kinds of bi-state relationships and agreements in place. For example, the services up to Connecticut and the other surrounding states. So we're not inventing the wheel here. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We know the wheel is there. We're basically designing this from a funding perspective to fit in with what's out there, what's successful, and what's working in commuter operations in the New York region, New York City region. So with that as a little bit of a background of optimism going forward, we feel pretty confident.
Okay, here we go. Off to Andover. Lake Hopatcong is the first station east of Port Morris, and the station was actually built technically as part of the Cut-Off project. Two tracks here. The left track is the main line, which goes to Hackettstown. Actually goes all the way as far as Phillipsburg, as a matter of fact. And the right track actually goes into Port Morris Yard. You can see Port Morris Tower coming up. The replacement of the cutoff actually will hook in or switch in somewhere approximately, we're coming up to that spot. The switch that they will use, the prefabricated switch, concrete ties and such, is off to the side. We will pass it in a few seconds here. You can see that things are starting to line up here. The cutoff will go straight. It doesn't go straight now. There's a temporary arrangement of tracks. You can see the concrete ties off to the right here. They're buried in the snow. But presumably they would be put into place over here right on the left. And then the permanent track would go straight and it would come close to where the tower is, and to the right of the signal. See Port Morris Yard off to the left. And we're basically on the right of way of the cutoff now. In 1911, this was all opened with 4 tracks coming in here. At least at this point, the plan is to have 1 track. And we'll show you where the Y track will come in a little bit on the other side. Now there's this temporary setup here that's been established. You can see that the track for the cutoff, it's not really the cutoff, but it's really a temporary track that's been set up to tie into the cutoff, comes across, and then once the wooden ties and you can see that the concrete ties will begin. That'll be basically we're talking about the permanent cutoff, if you will. Now, for the longest time, there were electric trains that were being stored here. Those have been moved away. They were presumably going for scrap. And there's still some of these electric locomotives, the Alp 44s, I guess they are. And you can see the track, literally the rail that's here, and that's been laid out, and that's eventually going to be pulled out along and will be used for the 7.5 miles to Andover. And if you look off to the left, you just begin to start seeing where the Y track will be coming in. We're crossing over approximately where the Morris Canal crossed. I think, in fact, we may even be beyond it, but the Morris Canal crossed here underneath the cutoff, and that bridge was removed. It was presumably the Lackawanna knew that was not going to be a full-time type of arrangement. And you can see the concrete ties coming up. Coming up on the Center Street road crossing, the bridge. And the Y track, where the wide track would be is coming up. We come in off the left to the left of these ties, and the wide track will join in with the main line at some point. Not exactly clear where that would be, but it'll be somewhere over here. And you can see the locomotives at some point they will leave. They're not going to be used for anything except for scrap, but at some point they'll be pulled out, and this line will be open for use. That's the Musconetcong River we just crossed over. Now our next point of interest, which will be coming up in a little bit, will be West Port Morris, the original West Port Morris. Where the line goes through a cut. We're actually on about a roughly 0.5% downhill grade at this point. This section was the first built or rebuilt, and was put into place for the delivery of the continuously welded rail, which we saw back there. This was originally still 3 tracks at this point. You can see that there's still some continuously welded rail here. I think this is about where it ends. Off to the far left is Lake Musconetcong. It's actually pretty big. The Morris Canal actually crossed in the middle of the lake. You see one of the last remaining, it's like telephone poles or telegraph poles. Actually, those at this point in time, or this area, are still on the northbound or north side of the right-of-way. For most of the cutoff, they're on the southbound or south side of the right-of-way. So at some point they crossed over. Not precisely sure where that takes place, but they do cross over at some point, or did cross over. Now we're nearing where the original West Port Morris was located. This is where it went from 3 tracks to 2 tracks. distance, you can see the 602 grade crossing. And that grade crossing will actually be equipped with what they call quad gates, and will allow for it to be a quiet zone. So in other words, the trains don't have to blow their horn when they're approaching it. So that makes it more friendly to the neighborhood, and also is a safety measure, so that instead of one gate on each side, there are 4 gates which block both sides of the road, and that would stop anyone from, and why someone would do this, but sometimes this happens, people will decide to try to go around a gate, and when you have 4 gates you can't do that. This is the old 602 here, crossing over the bridge here. That's been abandoned since 1990. And this is where 602, the Route 602 County Road, Sussex County Road 602, was rebuilt and moved. We should be coming up on, in fact, there it is, milepost 47. There are not too many mileposts that are left at this point. I'm afraid they end up as souvenirs, unfortunately, but that's just the way it is. Now, there are actually 3 different disconnected sections of the cutoff. In other words, where there are track, and then there are breaks in between where there are no tracks. For a while, there was actually temporary tracks here that were on wooden ties. That they were removed at some point. I'm going to say back in 2012, but they were here for a little bit. And then here we have the second section, I'll call it, starts up where we have track that's been laid. This is permanent track. And as you can tell, there was room for 2 tracks here. There was only going to be 1 track for the foreseeable future. The first section that we went down is about roughly 1.25 miles of track. That's a guess. Then there's this break, maybe 1/4 mile or a little bit more, and then there's this section which is about 1/2 mile long, maybe longer. And this is in a cut as well. You get a sense that there's cuts and fills, and that's the way the cutoff was built. And when the cutoff was built, it was built with the intent of trying to balance the cuts and fills. In other words, if you have a cut, where like here you have to dig out or blast out material, rock and gravel and dirt and whatnot, that material would be removed and put on a fill, which would be somewhere nearby, not too far, because it's not economical or practical, and we're talking now over 100 years ago, so it was even less practical in those days to try to move vast amounts of fill material for long distances. So you try to minimize that as best you could. But in this section here, you can see it continues to be a cut, and it's actually it's not a real deep cut, but it's fairly lengthy. And you can see the track here where it's been look like it's broken, and it's actually just the end of a section. My guess is that they don't want people to bring their speeders. In other words, these little track cars that you can ride on track. And what happens is if you don't have a continuous piece of track, probably people aren't going to do that. Don't know also that if in the because the track has been here for a while and they anticipated that it would be a while before it would be used. Don't know if with the heat and cold that it makes more sense not to do that welding at that point and wait until the full construction kicks in, which we're hoping is going to be sometime later this year. We'll see, and we have our fingers crossed. And if that's the case, then they'll come back here and we'll finish the job, so to speak. There's still some work that has to be done. Just because the track's been laid doesn't mean that that's the last thing. Probably some more ballast, the rock, the gravel, the large pieces of rock still need to be, some more of that will have to be laid down. And then you see we've now reached the end here of that section. That's section number 2. We'll be coming up on Sussex County 605. There actually are 2 bridges now. There's this first bridge we see, which is the new 605. And then there's the old 605, which will be beyond it. This historically has been a wet section. Since there's been a lack of maintenance of the ditches on both sides of the right-of-way. See off to the right, there's a wall that's been beyond it, or before it rather, there's a ditch, and the right-of-way itself is wet here. Looking back at old maps, it's apparent that there might have been potentially a stream that was opened up that wasn't originally there. In other words, when they were surveying the line, when it was, shall we say, just plain land before they actually started excavating for the right-of-way, that there was a stream that they somehow opened up, and that's what we see here somehow, and that the lack of the channels being maintained means that water is now over the right-of-way. So this is the new 605, opened about 10 years ago. You see the 1911 version, which has been restored. It's not really used. It's technically part of a trail, but it doesn't really get a lot of use. When there was some environmental issues off to the side here, not involving the cutoff per se, they actually had a trailer that was sitting on top of the old 605 bridge. You can't drive over it now. It's as I said, it's part of a trail, so it's really not accessible. You can walk over it, however. Okay, so now we're in Walton Cut, and this is one of those 70-mile-an-hour curves. This is you can see all the water that's coming across here. This is probably, and I'm not an engineer, so I shouldn't be the one saying this, but this probably is not something that requires a lot of work to fix, even though it looks like it's bad. But if you look at old photos, and I mean photos that from the time when the railroad was even in operation back in the 70s, this is all dry, and they just have the channels on each side. So the Lackawanna and the Erie Lackawanna, I guess Conrail as well later on, it was not really an issue per se. It was just water, and it just was something that was managed. But the issue here is that without any kind of management, you have this particular water issue. And at some point we'll get down here where there's actually I wouldn't call it a drain, but like a culvert that goes off, and then the right-of-way will be pretty much dry because there's no source of water. But this is one of the places which I guess would have been considered wetlands by the DEP, and I believe that's the reason why there's no track here right now. This has been approved, so this doesn't have to be addressed. I mean, it'll be fixed, but there aren't environmental permits that are actually at this point we're going to be required to address this. It's already been specified as to how they'll just rechannel the water here, and you can see we're actually going down a little bit of a stream as we go westbound. And in the distance, we're actually coming up to the third section of the the rebuilt portion of the cutoff. And that section goes about 2 miles. You can see then the water's going to just run off to the side here at some point. And because of the snow and it's been, I'll say, fairly wet in the sense that there's been a lot of precipitation. It's actually flowing pretty well at this point. Okay, now we're coming up on the, I'll say, the final section. At least it's been retracked. And this is actually the West Port Morris in the Erie-Lackawanna years, or after 1958. This went from 2 tracks down to 1 here, because when the cutoff was single tracked, the 1 track was removed. Actually, the westbound track, which is on our right, was actually removed, and the eastbound track was retained, which is where we are now. New Jersey Transit has decided to reverse that, and now they've put the track, the first or new track, onto the westbound part of the right-of-way, and we're actually traveling on the eastbound part of the right-of-way, although of course we're going westbound. And we'll be coming up to what is called Roseville siding, where there was Roseville siding. It was actually both an east and west siding that was here. You can see the right-of-way is still relatively narrow, but it'll expand out at some point. I'll point out, it's probably obvious for those of you watching the video, that there are lots of ruts on the right-of-way caused by ATVs and such, basically digging out sections so that you don't have a flat right-of-way, unfortunately, anymore. As was the case when they first started doing work on the cutoff here. This was nicely gravel and it was flat. And some sections are still that way, but some sections can be fairly dug out. So it could be a little bit of a challenge. We're doing the best we can under these circumstances. Okay, so you can see now we have track. We're coming up to another curve here. This is what I, in a previous episode, referred to as a curvy section of the cutoff. This is just the beginning of where Roseville siding was, or sidings. Now it begs the question, Roseville Tunnel. Well, we'll come up on Roseville Tunnel, but it's not here. But it's actually the closest landmark, I guess you could say, to this location. This siding went out pretty early, somewhere in the early 30s, 32, 33, somewhere in there. Apparently it didn't get its original use, or it seems like it didn't have its original use as much as it might have been intended to be used. Eastbound and westbound trains would stop here waiting for other trains to go through, probably freight's waiting for passenger trains. I'm told by Bob Bars, our friend from every Lackawanna days, and he also worked for Conrail. He was one of the crew members of the train. He was on the last train, in fact, as they pulled up the tracks on the cutoff. He said that there was actually, he talked to someone who said that they actually used the eastbound, certainly, track for storage out of Port Morris, and then at some point, I guess as you get into the Depression, the early 30s, they just pulled up the siding. It just wasn't used anymore. Now you see it's much wider now, so this is an area where there's at least 3, if not 4 tracks, 2 of which are sidings, however. Off to the right, a very large cliff. Would have been interesting to, if you're in the right location, one of those, not see this anymore or hear this anymore, but imagine a loud either steam locomotive or a diesel or diesels coming up this grade. It's still a little bit of a grade here that we have, that reverberating off of that cliff there, which is actually quite substantial. It actually, I think, guided the way the line was built, because they didn't want to necessarily have to take down that particular, try to go through that. So it made more sense that the topography would have dictated that they would have gone off on this side here around that particular cliff. I'll call it a cliff, but it's actually more than just a cliff. It's a sizable piece of rock that goes behind that. So this is still Roseville, what would have been Roseville siding. Roseville siding was about a mile in each direction. There was a little bit of overlap that occurred. I always think of this as perhaps the most isolated section of the cutoff. You think that some of the places west, and then there may be 1 or 2, I think, that in the area of maybe Cedar Lake and so forth, but they're actually closer to civilization than you realize. But this here is actually, there's really nothing around it, and it's very difficult to get in here. I mean, you can walk in here, of course, but it's not convenient to try to go in here. And at some point when their train's running again, this will probably not be one of the most photographed areas, because people take photographs of trains tend not to want to trek in long distances. But this is an interesting spot. But at this point, I can guarantee you most likely that there won't be as many photographs taken from here, just because from 605, which we passed, is the closest crossroad behind us, and the nearest crossroad ahead of us is still quite a ways ahead of us. So we continue on. You can see that the welded rail continues. And the curve that we're coming up to is actually the last curve we will have until almost Andover. There's actually a nice long straight or tangent section that includes the part that goes through Roseville Tunnel. We're actually on a sizable fill here, looking down both sides. We're just about around milepost 49 right now, 49.1 or so. So we're not quite halfway to Andover at this point in time. And you see now the right-of-way narrows quite, I'll say dramatically, but it's quite noticeably. And we're now down to almost the point where there would have been 2 tracks. Presumably this was the end of the eastbound section of Roseville siding. We're almost to the point where we're back to what the normal width of a right-of-way. The tracks will go around this curve. And they're going to end. That much I can tell you before we get to Lake Lackawanna, which is one of the scenic highlights. This is a scenic line. I mean, from end to end, it has it certainly has its share of scenic spots, and there's several that are here on the section between Port Morris and Andover. Just passing by a telephone pole. Now it's on the left-hand side, so somewhere between here and back where we saw the telephone pole on the north side of the right-of-way, the lines crossed over. Another 2-degree curve, which would permit 70 miles an hour. This fill continues. To our right up the hill, actually, is the Sussex County Library, one of the branches of it. I think the Byram branch it would be. This would be Byram Township we're in right now. Very tall fill. It's a, I don't want to estimate how tall it is at this point, but it is significantly tall. As we go around the curve. Jersey Transit has cleared everything off, not just laid track, but of course, before doing that, they had to clear away trees or any kind of like scrub or stuff like that. If you see a little bit that's grown back in the meantime, it's been close to 6 years since any kind of real work has been done here. This track here was placed in 2012, so to give you an idea, we're now in 2018, so it's roughly 6 years. And now coming up to the end of the track, and there's no track beyond this at this point. And we just go into what is basically an empty right-of-way, and there's been no clearing here either. In other words, at this point, this is as far as New Jersey Transit had cleared in anticipation of laying track. So now it looks like we're probably going to go back onto the westbound track because the eastbound track is still, the track isn't here, but the roadbed is still here. You have ties and ballast. Coming up on what would be considered to be Lubber Run fill. Lubber Run, which is actually the name of a stream, it used to be called Lubber's Run. Somehow it got changed. I mean, you look at the old photographs for Lackawanna, it was called Lubber's Run. Lubber is kind of a disparaging term for think Irish people. It's not a term that you hear much anymore, but like landlubber or something like that. But in any case, it was a term that, and they named the stream that went through here, Lubber's Run, at some point. Don't know when that actually took place, but when they built the cutoff, and then sometime thereafter, they dammed Lubber's Run, or Lubber Run, and they created what is now Lake Lackawanna, which is off to the left here. Very pretty spot. Fairly large lake, as a matter of fact, too. And there's actually a dam that's underneath, well, it's more maybe on the far right-hand side of the fill, underneath the cutoff. And that retains some of the water in the lake beside us, on the right-hand side, but the left-hand side is called Lake Lackawanna. Not sure if the right side has a name or not, but it might be considered part of Lake Lackawanna, but there's a dam in between, so I'm suspecting that isn't the case. So now we're on tangent, or straight track, all the way until we reach the curve at Andover Station. So right now we're at roughly milepost 50. As you can see, there are places where trees literally are growing up in between the ties. The cutoff, the tracks were lifted in 1984, so that tree has had 34 years at this point to grow, almost. It's actually surprising there aren't more trees that are growing up in between the ties, but it seems like it depends on the area. Some places you see a lot more, and in this area it's not really that bad. It probably is not a major issue when they do the clearing. The equipment, I'm sure that this is not a hindrance, but it just means it has to be done, and they will clear back. Must be specifications to how far they have to clear back from the right-of-way, but so what we see now is not what we will see when they start laying track again. They will have to clear off this section. Actually, they have to clear off everything from Lake Lackawanna west. The Roseville Tunnel, which we'll get to, we'll talk about separately, because it's literally its own project. The whole project is $69 million, but the Roseville Tunnel is its own separate appropriation, and the actual project and how it has to be handled and the timelines and all that kind of stuff is a separate project. Okay, now we're coming off of Lubber Run Fill, and we're just passing where that would have been a signal, the base of a signal here. May not look like it's straight, but this is a straight piece of track, or would be a straight piece of track. A giant cut, actually, at least on the north side, the right side here. And I would point out that when the line is reactivated, this would be a very good spot to get some interesting shots of trains coming with Lake Lackawanna in the background, which is off to our left right now. We're leaving that behind. That should be coming up to, we'll see how good of a view we get of it, of Wolf Lake. This is perhaps one of the most scenic parts of the cutoff. And you can see Wolf Lake off to the left. Here we are near Wolf Lake. We're roughly at milepost 51 on the cutoff. You can see Wolf Lake off to the left here, the south side of the right-of-way. We've encountered a tree, so we've gone as far as we possibly can using our car. So the rest of the way we're actually going to walk it. We will intermittently do these interviews, but the rest of the time we're going to actually use a device called a GoPro, which will allow us to capture our walking along the way. Did promise that we'd go from end to end, although also did mention that there was a possibility we might run into problems, and well, lo and behold, we did. So we're now going to proceed westbound, and we'll continue on. This is a straight piece of railroad, all the way from the curve near Lake Lackawanna, all the way through the Roseville Tunnel, and almost when we get to Andover, do we actually hit a curve. So, in any case, off we go on our trek westbound on the cutoff. Our next stop will be somewhere along the way, and on our way to Andover.
Recording.
Okay. Now we talk about there being a curvy section on the cutoff. Well, here's the lake section of the cutoff. Wolf Lake. Next we're going to come up on some ponds. We'll have, before we get to the tunnel, we'll have Right Pond, which will be on our right. Remember that, on the north side of the cutoff. On the south side will be ponds that don't know that they have any particular name attached to them. Roseville Road crosses the cutoff 3 different times. As we go westbound, this is the first time it actually crosses under the cutoff. It'll wrap around the north side of the cutoff and come back and dip under again, and then scoots around Roseville Tunnel, and then we'll cross a third time west of Roseville Tunnel on a bridge. So the first 2 crossings are underpasses, the third one is on an overhead bridge. Now we have ponds on both sides of the right-of-way. Okay, we are now on Wharton Fill. Actually, we've been on Wharton Fill for a little bit. And we're coming up to where Roseville Road crosses under the cutoff a second time. In the distance on the right is going to be Wright Pond. And not too far ahead of us is Roseville Tunnel. Now, Wharton Fill was actually named not for a person or a family, but rather a steel company. This area here was used for many years for iron mining, and while that was abandoned before the cutoff was built, the Wharton Steel Company still owned the property through which this section and this fill went. And as of this point, we're crossing over Roseville Road, the ponds on the south side, and then on the north side, Wright Pond. Which you can see through the trees. Now, if you look at early photos taken during the time of construction of the cutoff, Wright Pond is here, but the ponds on the other side of the right-of-way are not here. And in fact, they're not here for quite some time. So at some point, they start to fill up with water, but not immediately. Not really sure how long it took, maybe 10 years or so. We've seen photos from what would appear to be the late teens or early 20s, and there's still no ponds on the south side here.
As we approach Roseville Tunnel, I'll point out that there were alternative proposals to actually shunt around Roseville Hill, I'll call it, and not actually go through it. The plan was originally to build a cut. The tunnel became a necessity about a year into construction, and if you were to look back, which you can't really see too well from this perspective, but the top of the tunnel up above on the hill has been significantly cut back. That took about a year to get that far, and because of the nature of the rock, the idea of a cut was abandoned and a tunnel was substituted instead. Now this section here, for about 200 feet from the tunnel east, will be treated by New Jersey Transit. Treated in the sense that there'll have to be some sort of rock fall type of prevention installed. And then the tunnel itself is going to be trimmed back 15 or more feet. The tunnel is 1,024 feet long.
Okay, we've stopped in Roseville Tunnel. Now the tunnel itself, as you can see, is just rock that's been blasted away, or however they removed the rock to create the tunnel. This is going to receive a concrete lining, and as we move down further into the tunnel, we'll actually see where there is a concrete lining that was installed many years ago, presumably because there are issues with water and ice, even now where you can hear the drip, drip, drip. In our episode about Roseville Tunnel, we looked at the side of the front of the tunnel, and where you could see the rods have been actually placed down into the tunnel for the blasting. Now, in terms of New Jersey Transit, in addition to the lining, they're going to create channels or somehow a way for water to be channeled out of the tunnel. When we get to the other side of the tunnel, there's significant problems with water and ice, as there would be during the winter time. There's going to be lighting that'll be installed in here. There will also be a system that will allow the trains to maintain communication with their home base over radio, because inside of a tunnel you may actually lose that signal temporarily. So that'll be here. And in addition to that side where I talked about behind the photographer right now, where there's 100 feet or 200 feet or so of area where the rocks will have to be trimmed back and some kind of protection put up. That issue is far more significant when we get to the other side of the west portal of the tunnel, where we go and look at Colby Cut. So that's a broad overview of what's going to be happening here in Roseville Tunnel. This will be a 2-year project. So in other words, when this project starts, the contractor will have 2 years to complete the project. And so this is what might be called the critical path for this project. If you know project management type of speak, that this particular project will drive as to when the total project can be finished. Because the rest of the project, as we've seen, where we're walking along or driving along, there are tracks, and some places there aren't tracks. The clearing is not going to be that significant of an issue. That could be done. Now, I'm sure some of you know about the Indiana bat, and there's a restriction in terms of clearing, in other words, taking trees and brush out between April and the end of October of each year. That's considered the mating season of the Indiana bat, which is an endangered species. And even though its namesake implies that it's from Indiana, there is a little bit of
of the species that lives in northwestern New Jersey. It's really the far outer reach of the habitat of the Indiana bat, but nevertheless, it still theoretically could be here. Not in the tunnel, because they're not going to live in a tunnel. They'll live in a cave, and a cave only has one entrance, not two entrances like a tunnel does. But their mating actually occurs in the tree, so therefore there's a restriction during the mating season of actually tearing down trees. So that would have to happen, this is being 2018, would have to actually happen sometime starting in November of this year. Hopefully all that lines up and that's when it starts. And actually what's left probably, we'll be optimistic, probably will be done on those sections which remain, which have not been touched. That might be able to be done over the next winter time until the next, beginning of next April, that would be of 2019. So now we're going to proceed further west. We're going to take a look inside, go through the tunnel, and then we'll go out into Colby Cut and take a look at that area, which will also be part of this project. In other words, Roseville Tunnel is the project. We're separately funded. All the environmental permits have been approved, but not only is the tunnel the project, but also, as I mentioned, the 200 feet east of the tunnel, and then for 8,000 feet, which is basically all the way to Andover Station, that is also included in this total project.
Now here's ice. There's a big piece of ice, and there's water coming through the tunnel, as we would expect. Tunnels are porous and are generally a problem in terms of railroading, although they often are a necessity, but if they can be eliminated, that's usually desirable to do so. In this case, it wasn't an option. This is a historic corridor. The cutoff is a historic corridor. So there's a certain degree of preservation that has to take place along the line. There are certain limits. You can put in continuously welded rail. You don't necessarily have to use rail that was considered state-of-the-art in 1911 when the cutoff was built. So there are allowances in terms of what is considered historic preservation. However, in the case of the tunnel, the actual outside entrances of the tunnel are going to be preserved as they are, or at least they will look natural, although there will be, as I mentioned, there will be a certain amount of removal of material. As far as I'm aware, I believe, I don't know this for sure, but I believe the removal of X number of feet of tunnel would be to bring the tunnel under 1,000 feet, which would make it possible to not have to have a vent installed in the tunnel. I believe the 1,000-foot rule is where it applies. And at 1,024 feet, it's just a little bit above that, of course. Now we're roughly in the center of the tunnel right now, and in the distance you can see the stalactites, the ice, and here's I wouldn't call it a stalagmite, but it's like a pile of ice. Now this was a problem. It was known at the time when the cutoff was being run, depending on the wetness of the year and the amount, how cold it was, ice could be a significant problem in the tunnel. But apparently it was particularly bad on the Colby Cut side of the cutoff, which is the western portal side, what we're coming up to now. And you can see that We're actually coming up to where they installed a concrete lining, presumably to somehow mitigate the problem with water and ice, if only perhaps to channel the water down to the sides of the tunnel, away from the tracks, and then that water would be channeled out of the tunnel through drainage ditches. And we're just coming up on the concrete. We have to be very careful here because we're just coming up on a big iceberg almost. The ice is particularly bad. So here we are, and this is the beginning of the short section that is lined with concrete, and unfortunately that has failed because the water's coming through profusely. And so this will be a part of the tunnel that no doubt is going to require probably the most amount of attention. And here's a stalactite. My God, it's close to 10 feet long. That's a guess. Maybe that's 8 feet, but still. And I wouldn't want to be under that when it fell. Careful there. Yes, we have ties that are still here. That's the east bound, the old east bound track. And now we're reaching, we're almost to the portal, but we're now at the end of the concrete section. And actually, if we just very briefly look back, it has almost like an entranceway here where they put in, I'm going to guess, maybe 100 or more feet, not much more than 100 feet of concrete lining. Now the amazing thing is about, I'm going to talk about New Jersey Transit and what's been going on in terms of delays, but if everything works out, this may be the last time anyone's going to be getting, or the last time anyone's going to be getting winter photos with all these really quite spectacular stalactites here of ice. Because presumably this is going to be all cordoned off and will be under construction for 2 years. Got a piece of a stalactite. Stalactites are in caves where you would see them hanging down. Stalagmites are those which actually form from the base up. I can't imagine getting hit by anything like this. Okay, we're now at Colby Cut. At one time, there was rock fall detectors that were here. They're remnants of that system. You can see the wiring, or it's actually a fencing. And here's one, probably maybe one of the few that are left, a pole which supported the rock slide detector, which would actually set the signals to red and prevent the train from coming through. Strangely enough, the south side, even though it looks almost identical to the north side, never had rock slide detection, or for some reason maybe it wasn't thought to be an issue, but this side definitely did, and continued for quite a distance, as a matter of fact. And all of this is going to require some sort of protective type of meshing or fencing or some sort of way to protect from the similar problem that has happened in the past. As you can see, water is a big problem here. We can either go left or we can go right. I'm going to choose to go on to the rail right of way. The drainage ditch off to the left, that's going to have to be fixed. There's actually a place over here that where it's actually blocked. There was a landslide of some sort years ago, and that causes the water to back up. There's water over here as well, but these are basically gullies that have developed because of the ATVs. Now we'll just turn around and look back. Colby Cut, another rock slide, part of a rock slide detection system. Colby Cut, if you look at the top of the tunnel, you can see where the top ends. Well, actually, that's been chopped down a good 40 plus feet. So imagine that before this was built, before this was blasted out, that the top of the tunnel, what is now a tunnel, was much taller. There was much more rock there. And here the rock slide detection continues. One of the key problems of abandoning a railroad is that maintenance, not only are the tracks taken away, but the maintenance of the right-of-way ceases to occur. Not only do you get vegetation that grows, but you also get places where the drainage system no longer functions as it once did. So as concerning as this may look, this is probably not as difficult a job as it may seem. Particularly if you consider that the right-of-way functions well with relatively primitive technology for the better part of 3/4 of a century. sure that the engineers who have planned how this will be fixed have been able to figure that part out. I don't think it's that difficult. And here's where it's been blocked. Right here, we have the channel over here, the water's, it's basically, this is what happens when, with lack of maintenance, you get a rock slide, which apparently does occur on this side, and then end up with water. You also end up with ATVs. Should we ford the river here? Or? Now, a little bit of truth in advertising. We had the option, let me go around here. We had the option of potentially using an ATV to do this. Which we know would be faster, although chances are we wouldn't stay as dry as we are right now. We wouldn't be getting this same amount of exercise. And you probably really couldn't talk over the drone of the ATV. Although some perhaps in our audience would probably prefer that they hear the drone of the engine rather than the drone of Chuck Walsh, but that was the choice we made. As you can see, we're still in the wet section of the cutoff. More rock slide detection. Now the rock slide detection dates back to roughly about 1950. After the rock slide at Armstrong Cut, which closed the line for about a month, Armstrong Cut is the cut just west of Johnsonburg Station. And that particular rock slide in Armstrong Cut occurred in 1941. After that, the Lackawanna Railroad kind of freaked out, one would think, and decided that this was also needed here. Some kind of protection was needed here in the off chance that a massive rock slide would occur here and cut the line down. what they did was they posted a watchman. We're coming up on looks like a signal type of building, a little shed of some sort. But I believe that's the same location as the watchman's shanty. And the watchman lasted at least about 10 years. And maybe they decided that it was cheaper to have an automatic system than to pay someone to be here 24/7 watching for the small possibility that a rock slide might occur. I should have pointed out, and it's too late now because we're on this side of the tunnel, but on the other side of the tunnel they actually had, and I believe it was on the south side of the right-of-way, a short siding that was not Roseville siding, but it was a siding just for the tunnel. And for a while they actually stored a car that the men could stand on and could work on the tunnel. And at some point that was torn out, but it was there for quite some time. Here you see the shed. Or the shanty, well, it's not a shanty. The original shanty, I believe, was made out of wood. We'll show a photo of that. Now you can see we're coming up on Roseville Road again. This is the new bridge. This bridge was replaced within the last year and opened within the last year. Actually, August, I believe, of 2017, to be exact. And replaced the original 1911 bridge. The former bridge had a strange anomaly attached to it. And this came out in a accident investigation for a freight train that rear-ended another freight train just on the other side of the east side of Roseville Tunnel. The second freight was coming this way, and it ran through two different red lights, and there was negligence on the part of the engineer, who was claiming that he was eating breakfast or something. It was 6:30 in the morning. But the anomaly that was detected was that the old bridge would partially obstruct the view of a signal. Would have been right near where the shanty was, which you can't really see now. But in those days it was a semaphore, and because the semaphore would have been in a certain position, it doesn't make any sense to me, because it would usually be in a down position, in which case you'd be more likely to see it. But they found that that bridge over here, the old one, actually obstructed partially that view. Something they never considered when they built the cutoff and put the signals in. That shouldn't really be an issue here. We're not exactly sure what New Jersey Transit is going to do about signaling. They might have what they call line side signals. In other words, the red, green, yellow line side, which you'd be able to see like you have for your Lionel train set. Or they may only have what they call cab signals, which are only visible to the engineer. And we don't know if this line's going to be equipped with positive train control, which is basically increases the capacity but also increases the safety of train operation. We'll see. That's something that will emerge over time. You can see the 2017 on the side of the bridge. The bridge is actually officially, officially it's considered to be C17. C as in Charlie 17. in Sussex County. And from here, well, you couldn't see it now, but when all this is cleared out, because these trees got to go, they have to be cleared out at least to a certain specification. There should be no problem seeing Roseville Tunnel from here. And we're still on a tangent piece of track, so this tangent or straight track, if you will, started all the way back at Lake Lackawanna and is still going. And as we get around the curve, we will have arrived at Andover Station stop. And now we're just at the far end of Colby Cut. Mr. Colby actually proposed the station, not Andover, where it will be, but a station somewhere around here. Don't know exactly where it would have been. Presumably it would have been on his property, so he could have collected a fee for it being on his property. And Colby actually didn't own all of Colby Cut, or what this whole cut. There were actually a couple of different owners, but for simplicity's sake, the entire cut has come to be known as Colby Cut, even though technically speaking there were other owners that had parts of the cut named after them, and you'd have to go back to old maps or look at the photos that were taken at the time and to be able to figure out what those owners were, who they were. But Colby is the most enduring, as it turns out. Maybe the alliterative Colby Cut is maybe why it stuck, or maybe because Mr. Colby was a kind of a pain in the neck to President Truesdale. We really don't know, but whatever the case may be, in common usage, this is referred to as Colby Cut. And you can see there's actually some mitigation that's been done here to prevent any kind of rock fall off of this small hill here. And this dates back at least to the Erie Lackawanna days, one would think. 60s or 70s. Could be even longer for all we know. Now at this point we are somewhere between milepost 52 and milepost 53. The station is actually at approximately milepost 53. And when I say the station, you'll have to use your imagination, but there's going to be a significant amount of work that will have to be done at the station site. You can see over here that the drainage channels are working very nicely, and the right-of-way, except for what you would see here, which if you had the ballast and the regular railroad road bed on top of it, you would not see this water, so it would not be an issue. You have to realize that water is always going to be there depending on how wet it is. I mean, that makes sense. You know, depending on how wet it is, you have a dry year, you're not going to have as much water, but that water may be down here, but that's why railroads put anywhere between 3, 4, or more feet of ballast, and that keeps where the ties and the track is above that area that's wet. So even if there's water down below here, the track bed is above that. Now in the distance you see that we're just about to enter the curve, the final curve of the 7.3 miles from Fort Morris to Andover. Another 2-degree curve, 70 miles an hour. It begs the question, on the straight track, would the trains be permitted to go faster? My understanding is they won't do that, at least on this section. They'll probably restrict the trains to 70 miles an hour. But we'll find out. This section, with the exception of Roseville Tunnel, which was 70 miles an hour throughout the years, with a couple of exceptions, depending on the year and the timetable. Sometimes speed limits went up and down. But at its maximum, it was 70 miles an hour. But the rest of the trackage on this piece of tangent track was as high as 80 miles an hour. As would presumably be the case west of Andover, which is then even a longer piece of tangent track. And once you get past Andover and go on to the Peak West Fill, there is a good 7 or 8 miles of tangent track between there and Johnsonburg. Now, I'll just point out, because we're going to be on the other side of this area here. Roseville Road is paralleling us. And over on the other side of this hill, and I think it's probably behind this, when we go into this cut here, will be where Hudson Farm is. And we're going to come back out and look at Hudson Farm and talk about the issues that have been delaying the cutoff project. Now you see that the drainage channel or ditch on the left-hand side is the one that's handling the water. Once again, it's okay here. So, even though you can see that there are trees and branches and ties and leaves and whatnot that are in that particular channel, clearing that out and it should run pretty well, one would think. And all that will probably, I could be wrong, but we'll see, that will be running towards Andover Junction Brook, which is really the stream that has been the cause of the delays in in construction on the cutoff for New Jersey Transit. Very nice cut. It's kind of rare to see where the cut is more or less even on each side. Usually one side is higher than the other, but here you get sort of a balanced type of effect. So for the cutoff, this is somewhat unusual. Now to go over again what a 2-degree curve is. For railroads, I presume for roadways as well, they use the same terminology. At least if you're using the English system. 2 degrees would mean that for every 100 feet that you're going forward, the curve is moving a total of 2 feet, and one either to the left or to the right. In this case, it would be to the left. A 3-degree curve would be 3 feet, and so forth. And depending on the sharpness of the curve, that determines the maximum speed limit. There are things you can adjust for, like super elevation of the curves. In other words, you can bank the tracks, but there's a limit to how much you can bank the tracks. So a 1-degree curve, which would be not nearly as sharp as this, I believe the curve on top of Vale Hill in Blairstown is a 1-degree curve. That would allow for 80 miles an hour or more. And the curve on the far side of the Delaware River Viaduct is 3 degrees 30 seconds. In other words, basically 3.5 degrees. And that's had either a 50 or 55 mile an hour speed limit over the years, depending on the amount of banking or super elevation that's been applied at that location. Now at this point, because we're getting close to the station, this curve, and they may put banking on it, but it's unlikely that any train, at least at this point until the tracks are extended beyond here, that any train's not going to be doing 70 miles an hour. And here we go, we're almost at the station site, and we're about to cross over Andover Junction Brook. And true to form, these drainage ditches actually go into Andover Junction Brook, which is, right now we're on top of it. There's a shot of the Phoebe snow, which we'll show you. And the abutment here is not visible because of the snow. Just the edge of it. I'm not sure if that's what would be visible in the photograph. We will show you the Phoebe snow coming westbound, which is in other words towards us right now, out of the rock cropping, the cut, and heading, this would be a 1950s shot, crossing over Andover Junction Brook. Now, why is Andover Junction Brook significant? Well, this is the beginning of the station site at Andover. And I'm going to explain why it's significant. But I'm also first going to go over the chronology of how we got from 2001, which is the time where the state of New Jersey, the Department of Transportation New Jersey, NJDOT, becomes the owner of the cutoff through the use of eminent domain or condemnation against the two owners, Jerry Turco, who owned everything from basically the 602 grade crossing, which we went through just a while back in the car, and then Mr. Goldmeyer, Burton Goldmeyer, who owned east of there up to Fort Morris. Now we're going to actually stop here because this is the middle of the station site. And you can see the road, Roseville Road. It doesn't veer off yet, but it goes around a curve there, but it actually parallels the site. This is the site. All the way, not quite as far as the Peak West Fill, but the Peak West Fill is not very far away from here at all. But this would be the station site. Parking, a station, a platform. Now, what's the significance of the brook? Okay, we'll get to that. 2001, what happens is that, as I mentioned, that this is now this is the right of way from Fort Morris all the way to the Delaware Water Gap is now in state-owned property. After that, funding is obtained, and this is through our friend in Pennsylvania, the Senator Specter, and that's in about the 2003 time frame where they get money for engineering and the environmental impact statement or assessment that has to be done. That's one of those hoops. There had already been the one study that was done back in '89, which was, by that time, 2001, 2003, would have been obsolete. And you really, in order to get federal funding, you have to have what they call a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact. Skipping ahead, that will be obtained in the 2008 or so time frame. And that opens the door for funding, a combination of federal and state funding that will be obtained. And to kind of make a long story short, by 2010, that's in place. The final hurdle is leaped, if you will, or leapt. And the money for building or rebuilding the cutoff up to here 7.3 miles, what they call the minimum operating segment, MOS, phase 1, if you will, has been obtained. Now at that point, New Jersey Transit is involved, but also the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And in parallel, what happens is that New Jersey Transit, and this goes back to the late 80s. I was here with my friend Fred Wirtz, who showed me this spot back in 87, 88, I'd say I was here, where there was hope to try to build a transit village across the way. That's not going to work out, unfortunately, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but there would have been a transit village in conjunction with this particular site. But in the meantime, New Jersey Transit identifies this site, but the Department of Environmental Protection, because of the stream over here, says, well, we want you to look at a different site. And we will bring you down there, which is a segment which we recorded separately on another day, but we'll bring you down there and then bring you back and show you that site that's actually west of here, a couple thousand feet, I guess it would be, roughly. But we're talking 2010 now. While that's happening, actually the clearing of what the section we saw at the very beginning up by Port Morris, where they lay in 2011 will lay track, put about a mile or so of track there. In parallel, this is bubbling as an issue, but because of them having separate environmental or wetlands permits, that part of the project where we saw the 3 different disconnected pieces of track continued. That work was allowed to continue while things were basically floundering on this end. So 2011, the track goes down there. In December 2011, Norfolk Southern brings in a rail train with all the track that's going to be needed for the rest of the line all the way up to here. We saw that when we went past it. It's all neatly stacked in Port Morris. What hasn't already been laid west of there, about 4 miles or so of track has been laid. There's still another 3 miles to go. So while all that's taking place, that by, I'll say, the springtime of 2012, the track that we see now is there. That's now 6 years ago. So what happens after that delays the project is the question. Well, as I was saying, the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, is telling New Jersey Transit, well, you have to go look at another site. Well, that's what they did. Well, they basically wasted at least a year in that. They told DEP, this is not going to work. We don't think this is a good idea, so on and so forth, not to mention the cost. And we go down there, we'll get a little more detail. But what happens in the meantime is, and then we turn around and look at this brook here, the New Jersey regulations change. What happens is, and you'll see where the ATV is, he's almost coming up to where the brook is with the headlights. The laws in New Jersey change. Originally, if you were within only 100 feet of a stream, within 100 feet of a stream, there were certain regulations which kicked in, and where certain mitigation had to take place. Well, 100 feet is not very far. In fact, this station was not with the station area, was outside of that buffer zone of 100 feet. 100 feet would be, well, quite a distance from here. When New Jersey Transit comes back after it's been fiddling around or having to fiddle around with a different station site, what happens is that with the regulations changing, now that buffer zone has become 500 feet, which puts it well into the area that would have been previously identified for the station. Oh, horrors. Now what has to happen is New Jersey Transit has to restart the whole wetlands application process. Now, DEP could have granted them a waiver or grandfathered them in. They could have. But as we'll see, and then we'll get into the Hudson Farm issue, DEP, I want to really give them the benefit of the doubt, but I don't really think they earned it, what has been seen over the years. And this is but the first example. Now this will get actually taken care of eventually. In other words, New Jersey Transit will have to do what it has to do, fulfill the obligations, and manage to get itself the wetland permit, because this is considered wetlands, or you're in a buffer zone of a trout stream. It's not really a trout stream; it actually runs into a trout stream, which is the Pequest River, which is way the heck down in the valley here. It's called the Pequest Fill. The Pequest River's on the far end of the Pequest Fill, so that's at least 3 or so miles in a linear direction. But this brook actually runs into it somewhere downstream. But what happens next, after all is said and done, you think, okay, everything has been fixed and we're going to be ready to go and start doing construction, then the Hudson Farm issue comes up. And that's going to be the thing we'll talk about after we go, just to take a look down at, I'll call it the alternative site for Andover Station. It's never going to be used, but it was the one that New Jersey Transit looked at. And then what we'll do is come back here, and we're going to take a walk up the Hudson Farm. It's not very far from here. And along the way discuss why we're still at an impasse. In other words, right now there's no construction taking place, and there hasn't been construction, as I mentioned, for 6 years, partly because of this, but the rest of the time, it's been at least 4 or more years now, roughly, I'm guessing, that the Hudson Farm issue has been the holdup, and we'll discuss what that means. What does Hudson Farm have to do with any of this? And we'll see. Here we are at the alternative Andover station stop. This stop was proposed at 2 different times over the years. Once for New Jersey Transit, it was actually proposed by the DEP. Let's say, to be more exact, the DEP actually directed New Jersey Transit to find a different location than the Andover station stop, which was determined in the environmental impact statement for the federal government. So this spot was actually looked at by New Jersey Transit. This would be back in the 2010, 2011 timeframe, somewhere in there. It was rejected. They knew that this was not going to be feasible, but as you can see, we're actually here at the Pequest Fill. We're guessing a few thousand feet west of the actual station stop, which is off to the right, which would be eastbound from here. Westbound would be towards the water gap and so forth. The second time it was proposed, and this was more of an informal proposal, was by, at least the way I learned about it, was from John Urson, who is the attorney who represents the Hudson Farm IAT Corporation, which is involved, which has the property on which the culvert on Roseville Road, which we'll explain about a little bit here. Mr. Urson brought me over here to this location, and we talked about this, and one of the things we talked about is, well, was it possible to change the location? And I indicated that I didn't think that was possible, and I actually did some further investigation, and which I've been told at different times for other reasons, where there have been changes to what was in the environmental impact statement, where those changes were proposed, and the same answers come out as that no, you don't want to do that. The
environmental impact statement, and it's not a statement per se, it's actually a document which I have it printed out at home. The main document itself runs about 500 pages, but with all the appendices you would add maybe another 1,000 or 1,500 pages, so it's an enormous document. But the thing is that it basically is, I'll say, a locked document, in which case that if you make or try to make a significant change to it, then you open the door to all sorts of other changes and delays and so forth. So as you can imagine, there's a resistance to not making anything that is not really needed. And the change in location of the station, which is, you would build a station here, it would probably resemble, it would have to resemble something like the Mount Arlington station, which is up on a fill similarly, which is from this location almost 20 plus miles east of here. But to make that kind of a change, and it would have been more money to build a station here, obviously, because which you see, Andover is on a flat area, whereas this is up in the air. I mean, this is the Peak West Fill. So as a result, long story short, while this station site was proposed, it has been rejected for a couple different reasons. The one advantage that you could argue that this station site would have had would have been that it's on a side of the cutoff, on the south side, perhaps slightly closer to the middle of town, ever so slightly. We'll take you on a ride from here, which will bring you up to the other station site and show you the relationship of the two. But overall, it's a moot point, because since this particular site was not studied in the environmental impact statement, it's not going to be considered. So there are pluses and minuses to both, but it's really an academic issue at this point. It's not something up for discussion. But it's included here as just to let you know that this was actually looked at and was a cause of some of the delay for the cutoff project, the Andover section, because New Jersey Transit had to go back and reevaluate that site up, the original site, and look at other sites. As I said, this was one site, but this is really, I think, the one that, if it was going to be moved, made the most sense. But to go back to the other site, we'll actually take a look over there as well and compare. But just because of the situation, any other site other than the original site doesn't make any sense, just because the delay that would be needed in order to do the reevaluation just doesn't make any sense. So that's what I'll call the alternative Andover station site. We're going to take a trip over to the actual Andover station site, and we'll poke around there.
Okay, we're back here at Andover Station Site, and Andover Junction Brook. Now, the cutoff is just over here. It's in that inside of that cut there, and then the station site is to the right of the bridge, or the, I guess you call it a culvert, that goes underneath the cutoff, and then the station site itself is inside of that set of woods, but it's a flat area. This is one of the few places on the cutoff where there's a flat area adjacent to the right-of-way, and it was the reason why it was picked as a station site. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow this stream upstream. You can see where the brook goes underneath underneath Roseville Road, and in the distance you see Hudson Farm, which is where we're going to walk to. Now the question is, well, what does this have to do with the cutoff? Well, what happens is the Department of Environmental Protection, after all of the permits have been cleared for the cutoff project to Andover, someone is told, or somehow does, a computer analysis on this brook. And what they look at is the theoretical 100-year flood, and what would happen during the theoretical 100-year flood. And what the program determined was that the pipe up here, which we will see in a moment, it was believed that it might potentially fail during a 100-year flood. Now, a 100-year flood is actually more than a 100-year flood, because the actual definition includes, I think, either 10 or 20% overage. So it's actually greater than a 100-year flood. We don't know if there's ever been a 100-year flood. There's never been a problem here. You can see the pipe. And it's running pretty good. There's snow melt, so it's actually running probably a lot faster than it would be during the summertime. But that pipe continues underneath, and actually begins at a culvert that's on the other side of, just beside that mailbox on the other side of the barn, the red barn. So we're going to walk up there. Say hello to the dog. Now the pipe is actually underneath here as we go. It's only several hundred feet that it actually goes underneath the ground. Now the contention of DEP was that the 100-year flood, this pipe would fail, potentially fail, and would send water going down to the station site and would cause damage. And as a result, DEP imposed a requirement that New Jersey Transit replace this culvert. Really can't see it too well with all the snow here, but there's like arms made of concrete, which actually channel the water into the pipe, and the pipe goes underneath this road and all the way down to where we just saw that pipe come out. And so, with this requirement, the Hudson Farm people were put in a position of having to agree that this work would be done. So what would have to happen is that the pipe would have to be dug up and replaced. What that would mean for the barn, we're not sure. Whether it could be preserved or have to be torn down, not sure how that's going to play out. But whatever the case may be, until this agreement between well, it would be New Jersey Transit and Hudson Farm, until that agreement on how to replace the pipe would take place. Basically, the Andover, or this section, everything other than Roseville Tunnel, which is a separate project for all intents and purposes, everything else is stalled because nothing can proceed until this agreement between Hudson Farm and New Jersey Transit can be consummated. A couple of years ago, because this is Andover Township, the Andover Township committee became involved and offered to actually expedite eminent domain. In other words, to condemn, I presume only for like an easement, a temporary easement, in other words, where they would just have access for a limited period of time, do the replacement of the pipe, and that would be it, and then the easement would be extinguished, and that after that, then there would be, the pipe would be there, and everything would proceed. Now, the only thing is that there was also an alternate proposal which would put a pipe that would actually go from here, approximately over where the culvert is, and this is the dreaded culvert right over here, and would channel a pipe, presumably, and would go underneath the road on the left side of the road, Roseville Road, and then come out where roughly where the other pipe is. And so you'd have basically two pipes. I'm not sure if this would be the only pipe or there may be two pipes. I'm not sure, but that would give the extra capacity if in the event of this dreaded 100-year flood, which this particular culvert has survived Hurricane Floyd, Hurricane Irene, which apparently, I know Floyd, for example, got upwards of 20 inches of rain in some places in this area. If it didn't fail during that particular flood, I don't know when it would possibly ever fail. But be that as it may, this is the situation. It has to be done, and everybody involved is working on it. And until that takes place, we're kind of stuck where we are. So that's where we are here in 2018. Even the dog is probably upset about the whole situation. But this is the end of part 16. Hope you look forward to part 17, which we're going to go actually into the future. We're now here in 2018, but we're going to go into the future in our next part. And I hope you will look forward to that, and that you've enjoyed this episode on the Lackawanna Cut-Off.